Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw. Hello, so welcome to Shooting It Raw. And this week's episode is also going to be a re-release. I'm going to re-release episode 36 with Lisa Goldman on what it's like to ask uncomfortable questions. For those who know me, I had a massive change by basically setting up again in Vancouver. And so now I'm in Vancouver, and there are a lot of hurdles, of course, like getting a house and sorting out the whole recording studio business and all that stuff. So I thought, okay, I'd like to re-release Lisa's episode because it's wicked. She's a journalist, she's an editor, she's done such amazing work. She's done a lot of stuff in the Middle East, in New York City, Canada. And look, she's gone, it's really funny. She's one of these people who also goes right towards where the action is. Some people are going to be defensive and kind of get away from it, but Lisa, and I really am getting this feeling like her whole family, like her sister as well, Edina, they're also like they're all cut of that cloth where it's like they're going to dive into the heart of whatever conflict or intellectual area, whatever it is. So yeah, listen in. It's an amazing episode. It's fascinating. And yeah, what it's like to ask uncomfortable questions. Enjoy.
So for me now, mostly photography has become a political art for me. And I didn't really intend it that way. I would rather see photography strictly, as a more like a less political art. But because I spent so much time in the Middle East as a reporter on the ground, working alongside photographers, I started to really inhale the idea of the power of the image to affect perhaps not policy, but definitely the discourse. And so for me, yeah, photography. I often look at very old photographs. I'm also sort of an amateur history buff, and I love looking at old images from the late 19th century. But mostly I see it as a political art.
Okay, that's great. Lisa Goldman, thank you so much for joining me on Shooting It Raw. And as we talk, we'll get to know you. And we've known of each other a little bit, through your sister. I've always known about the great work that you do, and we've exchanged by email and never quite spoken. And so this is the first time we were actually talking to each other. And for me, it's a big treat, a real honor.
For me too.
Whoop! So good. You're in Montreal and I'm in Hong Kong. Is that right?
Yes, I'm in your hometown, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I moved to Montreal 3 years ago.
Oh, wow. It's been 3 years already.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so let's work backwards. From before Montreal, where were you living?
I was in New York, but I was in New York before Montreal, and before New York, I was in Israel. And I basically, since I finished high school in 1984, I spent about 33 years shifting back and forth between Israel and New York, but not every couple of years. I would spend like a decade in one country and a decade in the other. So
Okay.
it's maybe a bit too much information, but yeah.
There's never too much information.
Yeah, back and forth. And each time I'd sort of come back to Israel or come back to New York after a very long absence. I'm not the kind of person who gets nostalgic for places and visits them frequently once I've left them. After I'd been away from New York from 1999 until 2011, I moved back, and I really hadn't been back very frequently. And it was just like coming home. But yeah, so Montreal. And then shortly after Trump was elected in 2016, the election of Trump in 2016 wasn't like the aftermath of that wasn't it wasn't the catalyst, but it sort of shifted the way I saw the world a bit. And all of a sudden I started looking around at my life in New York and thinking, can I afford to grow old here? You suddenly you wake up to
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you're middle aged, right? And I'd always lived this very sort of bohemian, unattached, unrooted lifestyle. I don't have children, I don't have a life partner, and and New York really had, by then I'd been back for 5 years, and I had a really nice tight knit community of friends there, and I liked it there. But I was also starting to feel exhausted by how terribly depleting New York can be, and in many ways. Not it's also very, very expensive. And I sort of did some mental calculations, and I realized that I'd be hitting my if I stayed in New York, my earning power would never keep up with the cost of living, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
probably I'd reach a point where I could no longer afford to rent an apartment, and I would never have enough to buy one. So I decided, okay, I better leave.
Right.
So I left, and I chose Montreal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, sweet. Okay, so let's go into the first photograph. Just so that, like, usually that's kind of how I end up connecting and learning more and just exchanging more with the guest. So in this case, the one is telling a story. So it's a black and white photo. And let me just
Mm-hmm.
describe it for the person listening. So it's a portrait of you, very very nice. You're just about either you're suppressing a grin, or you are grinning, or you're suppressing a laugh. But it's a real sort of heartfelt, humorous, honest emotion. The image is black and white. You're looking off to somebody to your, I guess it would be your left. You're wearing like what's probably a cardigan, gray.
Oh
The,
yes. Yeah.
the background is blurred. It's a beautiful, soft, touching portrait. So why choose this one?
Um, well, I really like the way I look in that photo. It feels it reflects the way I'd like to be perceived by the world in many ways. It was taken by a friend of mine in Tel Aviv. His My friend's name is Idan Gazit, and he's a real amateur photography buff. He actually taught me how to use an SLR. And this photograph was taken in about 2010, 2009, 2010. And we were all sitting at a restaurant in South Tel Aviv that was very popular at the time. It served thali. It was called thali, and it served Indian set menu Indian thalis, and everyone just sat on the floor and ate. And it was a very relaxing atmosphere. And Idan had brought his camera. He was just taking random photos, and I was at that moment in the middle of telling one of my stories. I love to tell stories, and hit that punchline, and sort of, how shall I say, not exactly massage the telling, but sort of, make the. I like to tell a story that makes people laugh, and sort of makes them think, yeah. And so I was in the middle of telling a story. I don't remember what the story was, but he caught me just at the point where I was about to deliver the punchline
Mm,
of the story. Yeah,
nice.
and all of my stories are taken from real life experiences.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that kind of touches on an interesting point. Is that so? I had your sister on the podcast, and one of the interesting things that must have been in the water while you two were growing up, or it's definitely, I mean, from your mom, maybe, I don't know, is that you both have a very clear, conscious self awareness of around social justice, but also around either is it righting wrongs, or is it like figuring out how to it's a commitment that I find that isn't very common, but is
Hmm.
you both share, which is really interesting.
Yeah, interesting. You should say it. Hmm. So it's a very interesting question. First of all, we did not grow up in a political home at all. We never. I don't recall us ever having substantive political conversations in our home. Um, we were I grew up in the 1970s and in Vancouver, and from the 1970s to the early 80s, and we were what I would call. We didn't call ourselves that then, but I would call ourselves. In retrospect, I would say we were Trudeau liberals. Like we just axiomatically voted for the Liberal Party because I just felt like that's more or less what Jews did. I really don't feel that any particular worldview was imparted to us by my mother. My mother was a very self-absorbed person. She sort of had a lot of personal pain from her own childhood, and she was quite she had many, many loving qualities, which I extol on social media every year on her birthday. She died in 2011 of cancer when she was just shy of her 68th birthday. And, we had a very difficult relationship. And I think most of that was just because she was a very, she had had a tough childhood of her own, and she just had a lot of problems with not loving herself very much. And I think that it was partly because of that Adina and I are so conscious of our environment, and of not thinking only about our own pain, but about thinking of other people. I suspect, and Adina might disagree with me, but I suspect that's partly rooted in a reaction against our mother, who was, by the way, a very, very kind and generous person to her friends. Like, her friends will speak to you even a decade later. People will speak endlessly about my mother's generosity. She would really go to extraordinary lengths on behalf of people who, if they needed money or a favor, she would really go to extraordinary lengths for them. But in terms of social justice, I don't recall us ever talking about that. However, I will say that years after I moved to Israel, and I first moved to Israel when I was 17. And even when I went to Israel for the first time in my mid-teens with my Jewish youth group, I remember being very, very conscious of political injustices around me that my peers were oblivious to. And I do not know exactly where that came from, but I suspect, since I now realize, going back to the theme of acquiring wisdom toward middle age, what I've learned is that as you get older, you understand where your political, that if you have vehement politics in, like, terms of activism, or committing yourself to some kind of political work, it usually is an expression of very primordial and personal, it's and personal points, feelings, so I think that most people who make a really solid commitment, often to the exclusion of personal fulfillment, which is not the case with me, but sometimes it can be for some people. I think that that's often, compensating for, it's not compensating, but it's an expression of some kind of personal, something that comes from quite the way they were conditioned at a very young age.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that we're both very conscious of the society, of our place in the world, and how we affect others and how they affect us, and making the world a better place as a reaction to the way we were raised.
Okay, that's
Does that make
okay.
sense?
Yeah, well, look, I think part of what's cool about these conversations, like the podcast, is that we get to dive. I'm not psychoanalyzing you, but it's
Yeah.
a cool conversation, I find, to turn to somebody and say, okay, what do you really care about?
Mm,
How do you, and the frame that I'm using is, how can we talk about something, or about how you see the world, how the guest sees the world, in a way that
mm,
inspires other people. And so,
mm.
and of course, I'm curating the group by asking people who I think have something interesting to say. And so,
Right.
for example, I have a very strong social justice bent as well, and to a certain extent, I have a slightly similar growing up childhood, like growing up in Canada. I mean, my parents emigrated from Israel, and
Mm,
going to Israel young and being aware of what's around me and being sensitive to the politics, but then going back to Canada and having that juxtaposition reveal, oh, okay, wait a second, the world is really messy and things are very complex.
mhm.
And to a certain extent, you could argue that Israel is itself a country trying to figure itself out, and so there's a lot of tensions inside, in terms of ironing out problems, or the challenges, the social problems, the political problems. But what I find really brave and interesting about you is that you, to use an Israeli phrase that is very, I love so
Well,
much, you went into the juice of the garbage. במיץ של הזבל.
I did. עמית של הזבל, נכון. Yeah, I did. I did. Uh, Yeah, I did. Go on.
Is this? I know, and we're going to get into that. So, should we segue from this photo of you in Tel Aviv to the next photo? Because
Yeah,
would that open up that door, or will we get to there later? Like
I don't know I can't remember which photo it is,
the one
so
I
tell me and let's see what
the
happens.
one I picked was the one in Istanbul. So that's actually away from Israel.
Oh, yes, Istanbul. I was living in Israel at that time. Yeah. Interesting. Why did you choose that photo?
Because it's okay. So let me describe it. So you're inside a
Hmm.
cafe of sorts. It's beautiful. The walls are.
Mm.
It looks like it's made out of granite or marble. Inside, all of the furnishings, the tables and chairs are beautiful brown. There's somebody reading next to you the Turkish newspaper, but you can't see who that person is. Probably a little bit older in their 60s from their hands. Next to that person, you can actually see her face. Is a woman in an orange T-shirt. Maybe she's stirring her tea or something. There's a beautiful chandelier. The light's very nice, and there's two people on staff in the background, also nicely dressed. This looks like a pretty posh cafe for Istanbul.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and so when I was going through what you gave, I saw these two, and I thought, okay, well, there's a story here. So we are going to get back to how you went through the juice of the garbage. But so what's the story behind this photograph?
That photograph wasn't it. I took that trip to Istanbul in 2007 or 2008, and I went with a Lebanese friend who I'd never met her in person before. She had become aware of me because of a very infamous reporting trip that I made on behalf of an Israeli media outlet to Beirut, which caused a massive furor, which I absolutely didn't expect, but in retrospect was incredibly naive not to have expected. So I after that trip, like I received a tsunami of emails from Arabs around the world, around the Middle East, and some of them were a lot of it was hate mail.
Scary.
But some of it was very compassionate and curious and incisive and counterintuitive. And one of those emails was from this Lebanese woman who was at the time working in one of the Gulf states, but she'd been born and raised in Lebanon. And we started corresponding, and we became sort of email pen pals, and really found a lot in common. But she only had a Lebanese passport, so we decided to meet in Istanbul. So I flew to Istanbul. I'd always wanted to go to Turkey,
Mm,
and she and I really hit it off, and we just had a great time wandering around the city together. It's a wonderful, charming city.
it really is. Yeah.
I found, yeah, right, and it sort of I felt like it was, I sort of romanticized it at first because it seemed to me like it was so post conflict, and
Hmm.
at the time this was before Erdogan was elected, and it
Yeah.
just seemed like this very cosmopolitan, um, beautiful city with wonderful people and food. And I don't romanticize people; people are people. But because the city was so beautiful, such a beautiful place to live in, the people who lived in it were they suited the place.
Hmm.
They were very they would sit in cafes for hours and read newspapers. They would sit under Galata Bridge and play chess and eat these fish sandwiches that were like €5, and they were wonderful.
Mm,
And I really felt like Istanbul was like my kind of city. I still
hmm.
feel that way. Like if you ask me to name my favorite like 5 cities in the world, like Istanbul is going to be right up there.
Nice.
So we went to a lot of different cafes. This is one of the reasons this friend and I got along so well, because we both really enjoyed just sitting in cafes for hours and watching people. This was the most. This cafe just reminded me of Ottoman era Turkey. I
Mm,
mean, it just seemed like from something out of the Habsburg era or something. So and so I sat down there. I was looking around, and it just felt like another era, another world. And also the people, the clientele was they really were that sort of old fashioned, secular Turks, a bit snobby about the sort of rising Islamists around them. And I struck up a conversation with this older man whose face you don't see. And he spoke very good English, which is quite unusual in Istanbul. People don't tend to speak English so much in Turkey. And he was very fluent and very cultured guy. He made a lot of literary and classical music references. And so, inevitably the conversation is, well, what do you think of Turkey? What do you think of Istanbul? So I said, it's just so incredibly beautiful. And when I passed this cafe, which was a bit off the beaten track, I had to come in because it's just so gorgeous. And he said, yes, but he said, this place is just a relic. It's fading. It'll be gone in a few years. We're surrounded by all these parvenus, these nouveau riche people. They're building glass towers and all they care about is money, and the Islamists, and they're just ruining the country. And this is just, a little cultured piece that's left and fading
Hmm.
and will soon disappear. And he was, pretty overtly elitist, which, I'm only interested in hearing what he has to say. And he's a charming person. I might not love all of his opinions, but maybe I secretly share them too. And I'm just too politically correct to admit it. Um, and then while I was talking to him, I was thinking he really sounded like the old Ashkenazi elite in Israel
Hmm.
when they talked about the rising nouveau riche amongst the Mizrahim, or the disappearance of cultured life in Israel. And it was sort of like an iteration of, no one speaks proper Hebrew anymore, everyone's so vulgar, they care about money, what happened to the old pioneer socialist ideals. It was really like
Hmm.
the Istanbul iteration of a conversation that I often had in Israel with these older people who really felt like the state that they had built hadn't turned out quite the way they wanted, and that the lives that they had anticipated living just was, the life that they had once thought of as iconic, emblematic of what Israel was meant to be, was, they belonged to a dying breed. So
Hmm.
I really felt like this guy was the iteration of the sort of North Tel Aviv, sort of old school Ashkenazi Israeli Jew.
Hmm.
So that was one of my. I think I spent about 4 hours sitting in that cafe and talking with that guy and talking with other people and reading and writing, and like, it was a very peaceful place to be. But I also did feel that from that conversation that there was something a little bit shaky about Turkey,
Yeah.
and soon after that Erdogan was elected,
Right.
and
Right.
indeed things became shakier. Yeah.
My connection to Istanbul. Well, I was after I was run over by a car and all that stuff, and I had a girlfriend at the time, and we ended up going traveling the Middle East. So we spent, I think, about 5 or 6 months in Israel, and then we visited Jordan and Egypt, and we ended in Turkey, and we toured around. I mean, fantastic, beautiful, beautiful place. And when we got to Istanbul, we were there, and we ended up ending our 5 year relationship together.
Oh my God.
Yeah, 10-minute, 15-minute conversation, because we kind of just grown apart a little bit, and I always talk about Istanbul. Like, if you're going to have a breakup, Istanbul is the most romantic, beautiful place to have, to end a 5 year relationship. But
Wow, was it a painful breakup?
no, it was a very rational. I mean, she and I are both. I don't know. I mean, we just there was no magic, right? So because of that, it was like a 15-minute conversation, and then we went down to the travel agent, and I bought a ticket for Toronto, and she bought a ticket for Vancouver, and the next day we parted. Yeah, it was pretty intense, but romantic, beautiful city if you're going to end a relationship. Highly
For
recommended.
sure. I'll keep that in mind because my iconic breakups were in Paris and in Bangkok, and neither one was worth talking about. Believe me. So you sound like a much more balanced person.
Well, listen, don't project. But so wait, so let me rewind, because you kind of you opened the door to get to this photograph, or this photograph opened that door, and let's see what's in that door. Number one was, you had written a piece that had created a lot of noise and a lot of, I mean, you are a well published, how I would say was, how I used to put it is like a grain of sand under your lid. It's just, it's undeniable. It's there. People have to pay attention and sort of face it. So in your case, describe the article and why there was that reaction.
Hmm. Well, it wasn't an article. It was a television spot
Oh, sorry, yeah.
that I did. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So no, it's fine. It was a long time ago, a really long time ago, but it had such a ripple effect on my life, and I still feel it to this day.
Mm.
I mean, to a very small extent these days, but it's definitely not something that just faded away. So, during this was exactly 1 year after the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon. And everyone was, all these parachute journalists were rushing off to Beirut to do articles and television spots for all the international media, basically, about, where was Beirut a year after the Israeli bombardment of 2006, the summer of 2006. And that particular war, 2006, like it was very, it was something that I really experienced up close. I was up at the northern border during the bombardment period. I had a lot of friends in Lebanon, people I knew in real life, and people that I didn't know in person. But at the time, there was a whole sort of conversation going on amongst a certain kind of globalist elite amongst Middle Easterners via blogs,
Mm-hmm.
and so and also I was working as a reporter. I was working as a reporter and as what's called a fixer or a producer for a foreign correspondent for the European newspaper. So we went up to the northern border, and yeah, it was very, very intense. I have some very, very intense memories of being up there when the bombardments were going on, and we're literally on the border.
Yeah.
Um, so anyways, exactly when, and that war really was, I think, in retrospect, a big turning point for Israel, but that's a whole other conversation. So precisely 1 year after that war, July 2007, a friend of mine who was a dual citizen, she worked for an international. She was a dual citizen of Israel and another country, and she worked for a newspaper in that country, a prominent newspaper in her native country, and she got a commission to go up to Beirut with her Brazilian passport and do a feature report, and I tagged along. And I
Oh,
had never
wow.
been to Lebanon. And I was just, I went with my Canadian passport and we both checked into hotels.
Wow.
And yeah, and I just started walking around and talking to people. And I took a lot of amateur photographs. And here we are, photography again as a political tool. And yeah, we stayed there for, I think, 5, 6 days. And I really didn't do any active reporting because I didn't know that there was any legal prohibition on my being there, but of course I understood right away that, Israel's not a hot favorite topic in Lebanon. And so I didn't strike up very many conversations with people, and I just walked around. I had, superficial conversations with people in cafes or bookshops, but I didn't go deep. But
Mm-hmm.
I was very impressed by Lebanon. And I also, by the way, met up with a Lebanese guy who had Canadian citizenship and had lived most of his life in Montreal. And
Mm.
he actually did take me on a drive, but he was incredibly paranoid. I had one of those really old Nokia analog phones, and he said, he said, "Can you please leave your phone in your hotel room?" And I said, "It's turned off. It doesn't have a SIM card in it." He said, "Well, it could have a GPS device implanted in it, and it's
Right.
just not safe." So probably in retrospect, he wasn't that paranoid. But anyways, so I went back to Israel after that trip, and I was so excited by Beirut that I was like, Israelis have no idea how amazing and exciting and interesting Beirut is. And I am going to be the person who explains to them that Tel Aviv and Beirut are like twin cities and they have so much in common. And what are we all fighting for?
Right. Right.
And yeah, so I approached Tzvi Yechezkeli, who was the correspondent for Israeli for Arab affairs for what was then Channel 10 Israeli News, and the TLDR is that they asked me to go back to Beirut with a video camera, and just, yeah, and just, I know. I know, it was such a harebrained scheme, but at the time, I don't know, I was constantly doing really harebrained things. Like, if I were to give you a litany of all the insanely stupid things I did while I was reporting in the Middle East, like, it would take a long time. But so he's like, here's $500 in cash. We'll
Wow.
reimburse you if you use your international. Yeah, and they sent me back with a video camera that they literally taught me how to use 10 minutes before the taxi came to take me to the airport to Beirut. So
Wow.
I had no idea. Yeah. So I had the little handheld camera. I walked around Beirut. I engaged people in conversations. I asked them if I could film them. I did not tell them it was for Israeli TV. And the report was broadcast the night that Israel that the Israeli-Lebanon War of 2006, exactly 1 year later, top of the broadcast on Israel, what was then Israel's main, most popular television news broadcast. It opened the broadcast. It was a 5-minute report, which
Oh
I
wow.
literally like finished editing. I finished editing it like a minute before it went to broadcast. I was like, ah! So panicky. Anyways, so what I did not know and should have known was that Hezbollah monitored Israeli television extremely closely, and that's putting it very mildly. So they completely freaked out when they saw that report, and I figured all this out in retrospect, but
Mm.
they just assumed that that the Israeli government was trying to flip them the bird and show them that they could get anybody into Israel anywhere whenever they wanted. And I just didn't realize at the time the consequences, which sounds insane, but I didn't. By the way, one of the things I did for that report was I sat on my hotel balcony with my back to the sea, with the point where Hariri had been assassinated in 2005 directly below me.
Oh
And
wow.
I narrated a report in Hebrew, okay,
Holy
from
shit.
Beirut for Israeli television. And I realized afterwards, like, I was the first person to do a Hebrew language TV broadcast from Beirut since 1982 when Israel invaded.
Wow.
So,
Oh.
anyways, it caused an absolutely enormous storm throughout the Middle East, and I was getting insane emails, which to this day I can't quite get a handle on the insanity of those emails, and was caught up in all sorts of conspiracy theories, and I had no idea about the political implications. And in retrospect, I realized that the producer for that news program, not the reporter, but the producer, did understand. He was a very smart guy. He knew exactly what he was sending me in to do, and he knew what the consequences would be. But he didn't have the courage to tell me, "Don't do it." So, um, so I did it, and what I was receiving was, a lot of very angry email, but also some really curious emails. Like, one guy wrote to me, he said there are 4 million people in Lebanon. This was the day after my report was broadcast. And he said, there are 4 million people in Lebanon, and they all know your name.
Oh shit.
And there were a few foreign correspondents in Lebanon who wrote me incredibly, like, ad hominem scathing emails, about how I'd made their professional lives so much more difficult because now Hezbollah was extremely suspicious and was forcing them to get, new accreditation.
Right.
Um, and so, I'd made their lives difficult. And what was I thinking of when I did that silly stunt? And I was like, stunt? I really had no idea.
Mm.
And then, but also a lot of Lebanese people from not only Lebanon, but from around the Middle East. Actually, they weren't writing me from Lebanon. They were writing me, most of them lived in other parts of the Middle East. And, they were just a lot of them were just incredibly curious. And
Mm.
I remember years ago when I told Israelis about these Lebanese people who were just like curious in a sort of a benign, not hostile way, they were like, "Oh, they must have been Christians." And I was like, "No, actually, there's this amazing prejudice amongst Israeli Jews where they think that somehow Christians are less inclined to be hostile toward Israeli Jews, and that all Muslims are just like running around with beards and machetes, crying out for Jewish blood." And it's just remarkable. That was, one of the things that I was always sort of fighting against when I was doing my reporting in the Middle East. So, anyways, I actually ended up making some very, very interesting friends, including like one guy, not Lebanese. He was from a different Middle Eastern country, but very, very politically aware, very bright, like great guy. And he started writing me these really long emails. He was attending a very prestigious university in the States, and he was writing me these really long emails. And I would read them, and there'd be like 2,000-word emails, and I was like, "Oh God, I don't want to engage. It's too exhausting." And but he ended up writing me postcards because he was working for an international NGO, and he was writing me postcards from really extraordinary locations around the world. And then one day he wrote me an email that was like one line: "I'm in Israel, I'm in Jerusalem."
Whoa.
And yeah, he ended up becoming a very important part of my life for a long time, and we're still very close in many ways. And so there you go.
Wow.
It really affected my life. It affected my romantic life. It affected my friendships. It affected my patterns of travel. The subjects I was interested in. But it
Hmm.
also, it brought me a whole lot of trouble, not just with Lebanon, which I can never visit again, but also, with the Israeli, the Shin Bet was, they were after me, and I was interrogated, and
Oh, wow.
quite a few people. Yeah, it was not pleasant for me. I was I a couple of people in with positions of power over me in Israel, in bureaucracy, sort of used that trip as leverage against me. It was unpleasant. It was a hard time for me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's part of my awareness of who you are and my associations of when I think of you, because of what Adina has said, and now listening to you talk. I mean, from the first image, you like to tell stories and you come to a punchline, and look, I'm like that too. But that's a hell of a story. Yeah, that's full on, because I think it's funny or interesting to see what bravery can look like. And I know that when people talk to you about you, it feels weird because it's just you. So you're just like, oh, it's kind of like, well, you
Right.
have to kind of recognize yourself in whatever people are saying. But from the outside, the external, it looks super insane, crazy brave. So it's just like, wow, really amazing.
Yeah, people said that to me a lot, that I was brave, and it really it's not that I'm a person who lacks courage, okay? But I don't think that I framed that trip as a brave one, I was incredibly curious, and I just wanted to see everything and experience
Hmm.
everything. But
Yeah, we don't have to, like, because I know it feels really kind of awkward to be put on the spot and go like, yeah, okay, let's move on to the next photo.
okay, tell me.
Okay, so the next image is the Ramallah Manor Square.
Yeah, Manor Square, yeah.
Okay, so you're standing. Okay, so it's like a kind of classic landscape photo. I like what's going on in the image. So you're standing, looking at the camera. You've got your sunglasses perched on your head, wearing a black T-shirt, probably wearing a shoulder bag, maybe a camera bag.
Yeah.
Behind you is that class, to me, classic, very recognizable sort of the stone, the sidewalks, and there's like a lion sculpture, and there's these buildings, just two or three story buildings behind you, and there's a large billboard written in Arabic. I don't read Arabic. It looks like an ad
Mm.
for lime soda.
Yeah, so it's an ad for a soft drink, yeah.
Okay. So what's the story behind this one? And I'm sure you're gonna open some
So,
crazy doors.
um, well, that was a time when Ramallah, it's like an hour's drive from Tel Aviv, but it's a different world. And that was a time when I used to go to the West Bank quite a lot for reporting. And also, I had friends in Ramallah that I would visit, Palestinian friends that I'd met at conferences, and they couldn't come into Israel. So I'd go visit them, which sometimes felt like going on safari because, you leave and the gates clang shut behind you. Um, so that particular trip was a combination of going to visit friends and reporting. And that's like the center of Ramallah. It was taken in probably 2008, I think. And the person who took it was a Palestinian colleague named Samer, who worked for an international media outlet in Ramallah. He was very well placed and well connected guy.
Hmm.
And I think he had a bit of a crush on me, but we never discussed it. He was married, and so he was a very good photographer. He was a cameraman. He took that picture of me. At that time, when I went to Ramallah, I did go very frequently, like several times a month. Like it was a weird time because the Israel separation barrier was still not, it's still not really finished. But at the time, it was very, very porous, and so you could avoid the checkpoints quite easily if you were with a good driver. And but every time I went into Ramallah, I sort of felt, and I don't know, I feel like you can see that in my eyes. I felt simultaneously, very engaged with what I was doing, and the people I was seeing, but also like really gut wrenchingly troubled by, what
Mm.
was obvious to me was that, what was going on politically in terms of the separation barrier and the increasing checkpoints and the hostility at the checkpoints, from the soldiers, and the checkpoints were gradually becoming more and more privatized, which wasn't discussed at the time. The Israeli army was sort of outsourcing to private security companies, and a lot of these guys who were manning the checkpoints were not soldiers so much as they were Jews who'd come from the former Soviet Union, and they were pretty burly guys and very nationalistic and right wing, and they spoke Hebrew with heavy Russian accents. They didn't understand Arabic,
Right.
and they a lot of them hadn't even served in the Israeli army. They had served maybe in the Russian army, and yeah, they treated sometimes it was just agonizing to see at the checkpoints that uh, there was no language, there was no shared language, but the people who were manning the checkpoint would often like be very aggressive, violently, verbally violent, also physically violent, but verbally violent, with these
Mm.
Palestinians who might speak they might speak English and Arabic, but not Hebrew or Russian, and so you'd have these newcomers from the former Soviet Union who spoke quite poor Hebrew with heavy Russian accents. They had the power over these Palestinians who were going through checkpoints inside their own territory
Yeah.
and being yelled at and screamed at in a language they couldn't understand. So I'd always be a witness to these things coming in to Ramallah, and it sat heavy with me. But I didn't want to talk about it with my Palestinian colleagues because, what am I going to do? Like tell them how guilty and bad I feel about the fact that the country I'm a citizen of occupies them? It's yeah. So on the one hand, very interested to be there. Always good stories to cover there. Always good friends to see. Always interesting experiences to have. But also
Hmm.
feeling like a very heavy weight. And then it's always a day trip. I very rarely stayed overnight in Ramallah. Very rarely. There was this incredible cognitive shift, right? Because I'd get up in the morning. I'd have a coffee at my local like coffee cafe in Tel Aviv. And then get a lift or something to Ramallah with another reporter or a friend, and you just shift realities
Yeah.
in 1 hour,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and then you'd come back, and sometimes I'd be so heavy with what I'd seen, and when I could still go to Gaza, I'd also come back from Gaza like feeling a very heavy weight from what I'd seen, and you come back and everyone's just cheerful and going to yoga classes and sitting in cafes and sipping espressos and strolling on Rothschild Boulevard and with no clue,
Yeah.
really. I mean, and sometimes people would say, "Oh, well, you're in Ramallah. What was it like? What did you see?" And then their faces would sort of change when you would tell them, you would answer their question like, "This is what I saw."
Right.
And they would not like to hear that. They would say, "Oh, it's just a few rotten apples," or "You didn't really understand." That was my favorite one. Was you didn't really understand what you
Sure.
saw, and so after a while I just stopped talking about it. But I think basically at that point I'd been living in Israel for nearly a decade. I mean, I'd lived there in the mid 80s for a few years, and I'd come back in 2000, and I think by that time I was really starting to like that sensitivity to justice that we talked about earlier. It was really coming to the fore for me, and I felt that I was carrying a lot of weight on my shoulders, just I didn't want to be that asshole who's always preaching to people about politics, like those. I just, I'm not going to grab people by the collar and say, listen, you need to listen to me. This is what's happening.
Hmm.
Um, and be sanctimonious. So I didn't talk about it much, but more and more I'd be walking around Tel Aviv in a sort of a haze, and you know, I, I was feeling less and less comfortable in my own skin. Like I didn't really, I felt less and less like I belonged any place.
Hmm.
Like I
Hmm.
and I also like yeah, when I tried to sort of shift my social activity toward people whose politics were aligned with mine, I mostly didn't like those people. Like I found them sort of humorless and rigidly ideologically rigid uh, and sanctimonious in their own way, and so I was feeling quite alone. in that at that time as
Right,
well.
right.
Yeah.
For the people who've never experienced that sense of dislocation in a way, where and the thing is, you'd put yourself in that position regularly, right? To go to be in this
Mm.
one context one day, not one day, one morning, 1 hour, and then, as you said, like an hour later, be in a completely different world, and your brain is like, okay, like just this
Yeah.
whole, yeah, just the dislocation. And you'd do this
Yeah.
again and again. In a way, you'd experience these things again and again. They're shocks. Would you say that's part of what would eventually so for example, in my work, in my day job, we talk about
Mm.
how the power of attraction is not as strong as the power of repellent forces. So for example, when Delia and I decided to come to Hong Kong, we came because of the strong attractions, right? There were serious attractors that said, okay, come. So we did. And then over time, though, there have been little steps that have begun to repel, right? So in a way, those repulsive forces are stronger than the attractive forces. And in your case,
Mm.
the attractive forces of remaining in Tel Aviv and in Israel, which I can identify in myself as well, at some point were not strong enough because the repellent forces were stronger than the attractive forces that pulled you to New York, and now the attractive forces of Montreal have pulled you from New York to Montreal. So, because it takes a lot of personal strength, because of all the things that you could be doing with your time, you're living in Tel Aviv, going into Ramallah, going into Gaza. That says a lot about what you are like, about who you are, and how do you look back on that time now when you're about to enter winter in Montreal during COVID-19? Like, that must feel like a completely different world.
Yeah, it's. I think that's a really astute and sensitive analysis that you just gave about being repelled by a place that you'd initially been attracted to, or seeing the things that repelled you sort of outnumber the things that had initially attracted to you. That is what happened to me in Israel. When I got there in 2000, just before the Second Intifada began, and I saw the red flags of the place. There's nationalism. I don't really like that, but it also was a very exciting place, and it seemed like a very hopeful place at the time. Like, we didn't realize that all of that hope from the Oslo Accords was about to explode and implode. But I still really loved the place. But after a while, it became impossible. And when I think about Israel now, like as we look into the COVID winter of our discontent, yeah, I talked a few months ago. I was saying to some Israeli friends in Montreal, I think maybe I'm just gonna go to Israel for a couple of months this winter because, and I haven't been back to Israel since 2011, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I said, I think, it's going to be so lonely here with all these lockdowns and, prohibitions on having people into your home. And at least in Israel, I have citizenship, I have medical coverage, I have a lot of friends, and you can just go for walks in the temperate weather and see people outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
And for various reasons, I decided not to do it. And actually, these particular friends that I suggested I might do this to are now, as we speak, on a flight to Israel.
Oh,
And
wow.
just as they got, yeah, and they texted me just as they were about to take off, and they said, "This, we're doing it, but it was a bad idea, and you're better off staying where you are," because there are very few flights, and they're only direct flights because you can't, do layovers in the era of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and the flight they is full of people who, very religious people and people who are not interested in observing masking protocols and are fighting with the flight attendants. And yeah, it sounds familiar. So I've decided my apartment is my oasis. It's full of books and music, and I have a small group of friends who live very COVID safe lives as far as they can be, and I'll just socialize with them in the winter
Mm-hmm.
and just get through it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a big problem with solitude. I actually enjoy solitude. But like most normal people, when solitude is imposed upon me, it can become onerous, and
Yeah,
I
for
worry
sure.
about that. I really worry about that. But I think that COVID is so bad everywhere right now, or everywhere that I could potentially spend a few months, that it's just really better to stay where you are. and
Sure.
ride this one out for yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm nervous. I'm definitely nervous about the winter because you know how Montreal is in January, February until the middle of March. It's like you're snowed in, man. You know, everything is about the weather.
Between 2016 2017, I spent the year half of the time in Montreal and then half the time in Victoria, BC. Yeah, winter in Montreal is hard. It's really hard, and
Yeah.
the quality of life in Canada is really, really high. And it's really great, but the locked in feeling, and I can imagine with COVID, it's gonna it might even feel worse. On the other hand, I think how Canadians deal with it is by being social within the small sphere of people that they have. So seeing your friends and that in a way that's the same in Hong Kong. That's the same. Like actually, my parents were in Israel, and I mean, Israelis are like Americans, and they're just like, you can't tell me what to do. Like
Right.
I'm not gonna wear a mask, and so they had like
Yeah.
nine. I mean, for a city, like a country of like 7.5 million, they were having like 9 or 10,000 new infections a day compared to Hong Kong, which has
Yep.
the same population that has like 120, like
Yeah.
so my parents were in lockdown they went back for I think 4 or 5 months, and they spent about 3 of those months basically stuck in their apartment. And it's just, I don't know, yeah, sure, it might not be -20 or -30 outside, but
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. You get to Israel, you got to go to 2 weeks mandatory quarantine.
yeah.
If you don't have an apartment of your own to quarantine, you're going to be in some grubby hotel, surrounded by people who are making jokes about the masks and not observing protocols and eating crappy food, and then you got to quarantine again 2 weeks when you come back. And this is just a month in quarantine for it just doesn't sound like fun to me. I just decided that I'm just going to make do. And one of the things I do like about Montreal is that I'm surrounded by people who really love winter sports.
I actually saw just today, actually, the this post that you had put up, in which I think you went with some friends or something. You went to some of the cafes. I'm assuming in Mile End, so the Italian cafes.
Yeah, Little Italy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And for me, that is the best Montreal has, is those times
Mhm.
when you go into the cafe and you've got like people from all over the world who kind of mix the language, and you just have a great coffee and just, yeah, and sit and watch people, for sure.
Yeah, Montreal has it's a really charming city in many ways. It's very low key, and like I remember once I was walking around in one neighborhood and I ran into this couple that were Français de France, like French from France, and they just it's I think it's very charming that French people come here and they just assume that because Montreal advertises itself as a francophone city that everyone speaks French, right? So they just addressed me
Hmm.
in French, and they said, they said we're looking for the beautiful things and the sights to see. And we've been walking around and looking at all these houses, and we're wondering if there's any more neighborhoods that are more interesting to look at. They were in the plateau,
Hmm.
and I looked at them and I shrugged my shoulders and I said, "Listen, Montreal is not Paris or Lyon. It just doesn't have any like amazing, historical statues or." Monuments. It's just, all the houses pretty much look the same on the plateau. I said it's very charming, but they all look the same. And you can find richer residential neighborhoods, but there's nothing spectacular to see in Montreal. It's just very pleasant. And I suggested that they might want to see the botanical gardens or something like that, but they'd already seen the major touristy sites, and they were looking for some charming holes. And I was like, "This is what it is. It's cafes and shops and houses that have winding uh, stairwells out front, and that's it."
Yeah.
And they seemed to quite disappointed. But for me, this is fine.
Yeah, no,
It's
yeah, I agree with you. I
yeah.
agree with you.
So some guy, just to give you an example of, like, I'd almost let myself forget how bad it could be, but some guy that I met once or twice in Israel who writes a very far right wing blog. He's an Anglophone from one of the English speaking countries, and immigrated to Israel many years ago. Lives on a settlement, and a friend of mine sent me the link to a blog post he'd written about me that was very ad hominem,
Mm.
very hostile, and just published recently. And I'm like, don't these people just want to forget about me?
Mm.
And the mutual and this friend of mine said, I think you should take legal action. And I said, oh, for God's sake, no, I'm not taking legal action. I just want to forget about these people. Anyways, you can't just ignore them in a way. You can and you can't. So I started receiving. If I hadn't known about this blog post from my friend, I wouldn't have known what the source of the emails was. But all of a sudden, I started receiving incredibly horrible, aggressive emails with like rape threats and hate and my skin is quite thick these days, and I just I don't respond or acknowledge that I've received them. But you read that stuff and you're like, really, like there's a global pandemic and there are environmental issues and political issues, and at the time the election in the States hadn't yet been settled, and I was thinking, this is what's on your mind, somebody who hasn't lived in Israel since 2011, who once wrote things with which you disagree. You're going to spend your time sitting down and writing, you
Yeah.
know, violent emails to her, to a total stranger. But I wouldn't want to put my toe back
Yeah,
into
it's
that
obviously
cesspool again.
what a what a
Yeah.
what an idiot. What an idiot.
Yeah.
We've been talking about an hour, right?
Oh,
My so,
wow. Went fast.
so the question is, how do you do this kind of work? Because you have the kind of the motivation is inside you, and you're self motivated.
Mm.
Actually, what's emerged a little bit is that it is psychically draining, and it is quite it's very very it pulls something out of you that is that most people don't want to kind of entertain, let alone do, like specifically. So then what can you give to people listening to this as advice to say, well, this can help you pull through? You know what I mean? Like what for
Yeah.
example, what re-energizes you?
So that's an excellent question, because one of the reasons that things did become so hard for me for a few years was because I had not invested enough in those supportive relationships that sustain you when you're dealing with a lot of stress around you. And I didn't understand how important it was until it was too late. I was I'd been living away from home by that, for more than 2 decades. I was going through a time when I was sort of not estranged from, but not, I wasn't seeing my family very often. I wasn't investing a lot in those ties. And I didn't have a significant other at the time, for most of that time. And yeah, what happens is when you throw yourself into that kind of psychically draining work, you must have uncritical supportive love at home. You just got to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And because if you don't, you will burn out in a
Right.
bad way. And it can take years to pull yourself out of that kind of burnout. Years. And that's what happened to me. And I just didn't invest enough in my personal support system. I have a lot of friends, a ton of friends, and I love my friends. But you have to create, besides just good friends that you can sit and gab with, and you have to create or have a kind of a group of a small niche of friends or relatives who whose love for you and support for you has nothing to do with your work or
Right.
politics. They're just uncritically there
Yeah.
for you. You didn't meet them through your work or through your politics. They're just steady there. If you don't really have that, no matter how strong a person you are, and I am one friend once described me as tough as nails. And yeah, I am a strong person. I am tough. But people are, I'm also a human being. And I
Yeah, of
just didn't
course.
realize that, you can't keep throwing yourself against a rock. Eventually you're going to break. So that's what I would tell people, like, don't just launch yourself out into the world at the age of 17 the way I did and just throw yourself at every single challenge, uh, the draining challenge that you come across, without first investing in building your community. Does that make sense to you?
That was great. That was really
Yeah.
great. I
Okay.
I know it's very strange to kind of have an hour long conversation about what makes you tick, and I know it feels a bit excuse me, a bit uncomfortable or unusual, but I think it's been a real pleasure to actually finally get to talk to you, It's been
Yeah, so mutual. I want to talk about you next time.
sure, absolutely. But no, this has been great. What I find interesting as well is that you may not know it, but maybe you do know it. But in how you express yourself, in everything from your accent to your pauses to when you think, your sort of your reactions. Because I'm doing this is audio and I'm recording and I'm very aware of people's voices. I can hear, and you can take this as a kind of a comforting little hug, that I can hear some common tones and notes in your voice and in Adina's voice, which is really sweet.
That's
Really,
nice.
like
I really like
it's
that.
really
Yeah.
sweet. Even how you said that's nice. Like, it's like there's a cadence. There's a it's it's there. Which is I find very which is very beautiful. My big dream, I'll tell you right now, is to have you and Abby and I go to
Mm.
Cafe Olimpico or whatever and just have ridiculous amounts of coffee and just watch people and just enjoy.
Oh my God. You are so on for that. I can't wait.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting.